If you've survived this long, then you must be listening to the Paperback Warrior podcast.
Hello. It's May 4th, 2020, and this is episode 42 of the Paperback Warrior podcast. If you're a new listener, we want to welcome you, and if you're a regular, we want to welcome you back. We run a website at paperbackwarrior.com where we post daily reviews of old paperbacks from the 20th century in the men's adventure, crime, western, and spy genres. As you may have gathered by now, we also do a weekly podcast and discussing old books. You can find all 42 episodes on your favorite podcast app, or you can go to the Paperback Warrior website. If you like what you hear, please consider donating via PayPal at our website to keep us ad and paywall free. Let me introduce my co-host Tom, who's going to tell us what we have this episode.
Thank you, Eric. On this week's episode, I'm going to do a feature on a 1950s crime and western author that you should know about. His name's William Ard, and I'm going to be reviewing his first book in the Lou Largo series called All I Can Get. Meanwhile, Eric, you are going to be reviewing Day of the Gun by Clifton Adams. But before we do the feature, you have left your doomsday bunker to do some shopping, right?
Well, no, not really.
Oh.
This is a funny story.
Okay, lay it on me.
So one of my daughters traveled to Puerto Rico right before the quarantine became really, really strict, right? When she returned, she did the 14-day quarantine between my house and her mother's residence. So I was strictly homebound at this time. You shared some unfortunate news that a local bookstore we frequent called Black Sheep Books announced that they were going out of business beginning that Saturday. Now, my wife lives at her apartment until both of our leases expire this spring. We're married, but we don't live together.
This is quite an org chart you're drawing.
Yeah, right? So we're in two separate residences. However, she wasn't under quarantine, so listen, I convinced her to go to the bookstore sale for me and shop via FaceTime on the phone with me.
Like a bomb-diffusing drone?
Yes,
right.
Exactly.
Like the bomb. Okay, go ahead. I'm listening.
Well, Tom, it worked. So she held the phone up, and I browsed the shelves through FaceTime. The miracles of modern science. And my wife was so patient, and she scooted when she needed to. She moved around the smelly dude.
This is some newlywed stuff, man. Enjoy this while it lasts. This type of service is not going to last.
I'm loving it. But she successfully navigated through all the clutter of boxes because this guy's going out of business. I knew the layout of the store, so I was sort of her GPS as she browsed the shelves. I'm really thankful for her doing that. I owe her big time. The store was doing half off, which made most of the books about $1.50. Some of them were even cheaper than that. So here's some of the highlights. I got 8 books in the Matt Helm series. Most of these were probably second or third printings on Fawcett Gold Medal. I also got Donald Hamilton's Murder Twice Told, which you reviewed on the blog. I got 21 of those Belmont Tarzan paperbacks. These were really beautiful. They were in great shape. The owner had them in bags. I also got 5 non-Tarzan books by Burroughs. I was able to buy a Fawcett Gold Medal of Louis L'Amour's Hondo. I also got Frank Slaughter's Appalachian Gold. I think he wrote this before he started doing medical thrillers. I also got a Western called Boulder Dam by Zane Grey. I picked up an old espionage book called Intrigue in Paris by Sterling Noel. I got a few other odds and ends, but now listen. I have a wish list of books that I occasionally send my wife. So Sarah came through big time by surprising me with a book she ordered called The Rape of a Town by Norman Daniels.
Oh, wow.
Now, we just covered Norman Daniels a few weeks ago with his novel The Captive. Now, The Rape of a Town appeared as a condensed version in a magazine called Men in April of 1971. It was illustrated by Samson Pollan and titled The Town That Bottled a Hoodlum Army. I first found out about this book on Bob Dice's Men's Adventure magazine's Facebook group page. He had responded to our review of The Captive and posted a photo of this condensed story, and he mentioned the book's name. I'm really anxious to read it, and I want to review it for the blog. Before I forget, though, mentioning Bob Dice, he runs the menspulpmags.com site, and he's once again teamed up with Wyatt Doyle for another awesome book, Tom. This one is called One Man Army, the action paperback art of Gil Cohen.
Oh, that's going to be awesome. It's probably, a lot of Mac Bolan covers and stuff?
Yes, if you love Mac Bolan, you love Executioner, you're going to love this. I ordered my copy. I'm waiting for it to come in. It's published by New Texture, and those guys do such a great job. I'm really looking forward to it.
They're like art pieces. They're like they're like coffee table books for dudes.
Yeah, they're really awesome. All right. So
that sounds great. So are you ready for the feature?
Yeah. Let's go ahead and go then.
All right. All right, so I'm going to be talking about an author named William Ard today. William Thomas Ard was born in 1922 and grew up in Brooklyn. Now, he went to Dartmouth College, and he graduated in 1944, and he joined the U.S. Marine Corps. Now, he never saw combat because he had an accident, either in training or very early in his career, that severed a bunch of tendons in his right hand, and so he was discharged before the war ended. So Ard goes back to Brooklyn to live with his mom and dad, and for a short period of time, he worked as a private detective for some other agency. Now, I don't gather that this was a big part of his life, but it's interesting that a real-life private detective went on to write so many successful private eye novels. It reminds me a little bit of Dashiell Hammett, who was a private eye for Pinkerton before he started writing, and he used that experience to write his Continental Ops stories, basically by turning Pinkerton into the Continental Detective Agency. Anyway, back to Ard. He gets a job as a copywriter for a big ad agency in Manhattan, and he meets a girl who works for that agency, and they get married. So hopefully this is starting to take shape. What we have is a tough Brooklyn kid, an Ivy League education, Marine Corps trained, worked as a private eye, and then he starts writing for a living. His next job was as a publicity writer for Warner Brothers in their New York office. He kept getting promoted at Warner Brothers until 1950 when he quit to become a full-time freelance writer. Now, Eric, let's see if you've been paying attention to the podcast. What is significant about 1950? Why would a successful ad man with a wife and 2 kids leave a high-paying corporate gig to become a freelance writer in 1950?
Oh, I think I know this, Mr. Simon. The invention of the paperback novel.
Bingo. Yes, you get to go to the front of the class. And Ard was no dummy. In 1949, the pulp magazines had died, and the hot new literary entertainment were these 25-cent paperback original novels. Now, prior to that, the paperbacks were just basically reprinting literary hardcovers. But by 1950, all that had changed. Authors with the ability to create lurid, violent, and exciting plots would be able to make a small fortune cranking out paperback original novels. And who was leading that charge, young Eric?
It's Mickey Spillane.
Yes, correctamundo. Mickey Spillane's Mike Hammer was a paperback sensation, and anyone who wanted to make a killing in paperbacks would have done well to emulate Spillane's hard-boiled style. So as soon as Ard started writing novels, he was a darn machine. He basically averaged a book every 4 months for a decade. 55 books total, I'm told. He needed to employ some pseudonyms to avoid flooding the market more than he was already under his own name. So in the mystery genre, he was Thomas Wills, Ben Kerr, and Mike Moran. And when he wrote westerns, he was Jonas Ward. And we'll circle back to some of these guys later. His first book was called The Perfect Frame, and it was published when he was 28 years old in 1951. After The Perfect Frame, he had 4 titles published in 1952. Then dig this lineup. 5 books in 1953, 5 in 1954, 3 in 55, 5 in 56, 3 in 57, 5 in 1958, 3 in 59, 10 books released in 1960, 10 in 1961, and 2 books in 1962. This guy could write fast. The publishers reported that sales of his books, released by the paperback imprint Popular Library alone, he did books for multiple publishers, but Popular Library did a lot of them, over 5 million copies sold. Once he started to sell some books, he did what every single author that I love seemed to do. He moved to Florida, specifically Clearwater, right by Tampa, which is where a lot of his books actually take place. Man, this guy was a star. He sold a ton of books, and it remains a mystery to me, Eric, why he's not remembered, along with Spillane, John D. MacDonald, Ross MacDonald, and all the other big sellers of the 1950s. His most successful series was starred a private eye named Timothy Dane, who was based in New York City, and he debuted in that 1951, that first book, The Perfect Frame. Timothy Dane was a normal, well-adjusted former Marine who carries a .45. He likes the ladies. He's willing to get violent. There were 10 Timothy Dane books between 1951 and 1957. I'm not going to read them all to you, what the titles were, but 1951 was The Perfect Frame, and the last one was called Root of His Evil, which was retitled Deadly Beloved from 1957. At the same time that he was releasing the Timothy Dane series, he also began writing about another private eye named Johnny Stevens, who was a New York operative for the Flanagan Detective Agency, run by a gruff Mick named Flanagan. And this series lasted for 6 books, beginning with Shakedown in 1952 and ending with The Blonde and Johnny Malloy in 1958. And so under the name Thomas Wills, he wrote a 2-book series starring a private eye named Barney Glines. These get relevant later, and You'll Get Yours was the first one of the books. It was 1952, and the second one was Mine to Avenge in 1955. And again, this stars private eye Barney Glines, and these were written under the pseudonym Thomas Wills. Now, You'll Get Yours was reprinted under Ard's own name by Starkhouse's Black Gat imprint recently. And I think, Eric, you reviewed this one for Paperback Warrior, right?
Right, yeah, and I remember really liking it. It was a gutsy and really violent novel, considering 1952 was its publication. There's a number of deaths, there's detailed drug abuse, and in terms of violence, I mean, let's say 1970s and 80s men's action-adventure might be a close comparison. Tom, there was this one shocking scene in that book where thugs hold Glines down while absolutely obliterating a drugged-out hooker in a hail of bullets. That's bold. But what's really interesting about Ard's position is his candid look at the price of popularity and fame as a central part of the plot, and it involved the attempted recovery of these compromising pictures involving an up-and-coming Hollywood starlet. The short answer is that You'll Get Yours was really, really good. I want to read the sequel one day. I was looking at the prices, and it's really expensive, but I saw that you actually have a copy of it. So.
Yeah, so why don't you, because you've covered the first one, I'm dying to read them both, because I've fallen in love with this guy Ard, but why don't you read and review the second one, and then when you die of old age and I'm still young and fit, I'll just read them both.
Okay.
Another series he wrote was the Danny Fontaine series. This is a little confusing because the character was originally called Mike Fontaine and then later became Danny in a subsequent reprint. We first meet Mike Fontaine in As Bad as I Am in 1959. He's a struggling New York actor. Perhaps struggling more than most, he's just been released from prison after serving 5 years for killing a man and beating a woman. Now, this is where it gets interesting. He meets a private detective named Barney Glines, which is the hero of the 2 PI books that you read the first one, that he wrote under the Thomas Wills pseudonym. So he kind of jumps from a character that he wrote in a pseudonym being the main character to Barney Glines being a side character in a different series under his own name, like he's Stan Lee or something.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and so it's a weird little crossover, especially since it jumped from the pseudonym to Ard's real name. In the first book, As Bad as I Am from 1959, which was retitled Wanted Danny Fontaine, Fontaine and Glines worked together to clear Fontaine's good name. Because remember, he's a jailbird who just got out of prison. In the second book, When She Was Bad from 1960, Danny Fontaine, no longer named Mike, is a junior partner working for Barney Glines' agency. Now, Glines too busy in this novel to work a case. It comes in the door, and so he sends this wet behind-the-ear investigator named Fontaine to handle it. Now, there's 2 other series from Ard that we need to talk about, and things get a little confusing here, so try to follow along, Eric. The first one is the Lou Largo series, and the second is the Buchanan series of Westerns written under the pseudonym of Jonas Ward. The reason things get confusing here is because Ard died on March 12, 1960, at age 37 or 38. I've read both. He died of cancer. And I don't have the details, but in every publicity shot with Ard that I've seen of Ard, he's smoking a cigarette. So, in complete tragedy, though, man. There's a young guy, age 37, 38, not only for his family, but for readers like me and you who want to read more of this guy's books, because this guy was so good. He had a bunch of books in the pipeline, so Ard titles kept coming out until 1962 or so. Anyway, getting back to the Lou Largo series, it went on for 6 books released between 1959 and 1962. all of whom are credited as books by William Ard. However, only the first two books, All I Can Get and Like Ice She Was, were actually written by Ard. Lou Largo Book 3, which is called Babe in the Woods, was written by Lawrence Block. Ard wrote the first couple chapters and the plot outline, and Block, before he was famous, wrote the rest of the book. So I recently reached out for Lawrence Block on Twitter to ask him if he would be willing to put this book back in print. I said, would you ever consider making your sole Lou Largo novel, Babe in the Woods, written as William Ard, available as an affordable ebook? I'm dying to read it, but I can't justify $50 for a used paperback. Thanks. Within about 15 minutes, Lawrence Block replied, kind of putting me in my place, I don't own the rights. Don't think of the book as mine, and don't believe it's worth anybody's time. I finished a book a man left uncompleted at his death and only made a sow's ear and a dog's breakfast. So no.
Pretty straightforward.
He doesn't. I mean, at his age, Lawrence Block doesn't need to be pulling punches or taking guff from a young whippersnapper like me. The rest of the Lou Largo books 4, 5, and 6, were actually written by John Jakes, who later went on to become famous writing Civil War historical novels, including North and South, which is a massive bestseller. It's still in print to this day. But John Jakes was writing Lou Largo books before he was famous. I have not asked John Jakes for if he's interested in getting them reprinted. I can't stand another tongue lashing. So I recently read and reviewed Lou Largo #1, All I Can Get, for the Paperback Warrior blog, and I loved it. It was one of the best books I've read this year, and I'm going to give it a proper review later in the show. Now, the Tom Buchanan Western series was started by Ard and written under the Jonas Ward pen name. Now, he chose that name for the Buchanan books because, he used to work for the Buchanan Ad Agency in New York when he was a copywriter, and he basically took the name Ard, added a W to the beginning, and that's where he got the Ward part. This guy I know named Dennis Miller wrote this fantastic biography of William Ard for Paperback Parade magazine, and it's posted on a website. He describes the appeal of the Buchanan series as follows. These are Dennis's words. But one characteristic makes Buchanan unique in Western heroes. He laughs. This was the genius of Ard's creation. Up until Buchanan, most Western heroes were serious, tight-lipped guys who say little and, despite their humility, seem full of themselves. Buchanan was also a nice man. He minds his own business, isn't overly ambitious in the usual sense, and is the kind of guy who, though he's 6 foot 6 inches tall, wouldn't be an imposition if he stayed with you. You like him. You feel comfortable sipping a coffee or a whiskey with him. You so identify with the guy that it's upsetting when someone comes along and makes this good-humored fellow mad and forces him to shed his gentle air and become reluctantly violent and often deadly. The guy loves children, treats women with great respect, and hates to harm anything. But anyone who makes him really mad usually gets killed. And Ard fully completed 5 of the Buchanan novels, and the 6th one, Buchanan on the Prod, was Ard's except for the last chapter. In fact, it was none other than Robert Silverberg who completed the last chapter of Buchanan on the Prod. Brian Garfield wrote the 7th Buchanan novel, Buchanan's Gun, and William R. Cox wrote the rest of the books. Now, you actually read a Buchanan book and liked it, right?
Yeah, I did. I read Buchanan Says No, and I reviewed it here at Paperback Warrior. It was published in 1957 and was, I believe, the second book in the series. Now, what's cool about Buchanan is that it's sort of tongue-in-cheek funny. I remember in that book there's a scene where Buchanan has a woman in his bed while another woman is standing at the door waiting for her turn. But it's violent when it needs to be. Buchanan is a fast draw. He's an intelligent hero. And he plays the part of this aimless drifter who's mending fences and riding on cattle drives and so forth. Anything that can really just propel him right into the action. Buchanan is just a really fun, and it's a unique Western series. I haven't had experience with the non-Ard titles in the series, but from what I read from William Ard, I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, he's great. And so here's the bottom line for Paperback Warrior listeners. William Ard is awesome, and you should read his books. But there's a problem. The downside with William Ard is that he's considered to be, quote-unquote, collectible by the types of people who buy vintage paperbacks, encase them in plastic, and never read a word. But there's an answer. There's a company called Ramble House, not Random House, but Ramble, Ramble House. And they've been putting out William Ard books, mostly the private eye novels, in trade paperback doubles. For example, the first 2 Lou Largo novels are All I Can Get and Like Ice She Was. And Ramble House compiled these into one volume titled Calling Lou Largo. Anyway, Ramble House has a bunch of these. Few, if any, are available as ebooks for some reason. I don't really understand the business move they're making, but that's up to them. But the trade paperbacks, and I'm holding one up for you here, are very nicely packaged, and they're very well formatted. There's no, I never saw a single optical character recognition error like you get in some of these reprints. And some actually have really fun introductions about Ard. So I recommend that you read Ard. And the way, if you don't want to spend a fortune on the paperbacks, you can go to www.ramblehouse.com and get these books while they're still in print, because the original Ard paperbacks are just expensive as hell. I think Ramble House also their double novels with the Ard books may also be available on Amazon, but you can buy it directly from their website. In fact, they have an awesome back catalog. That Ramble House is a great publisher. They also have you'll appreciate this, a ton of Day Keen short stories from the pulps that they've compiled into short story compilations. Anyway, so that's ramblehouse.com. Check them out. I want to give credit where credit is due to the who did the homework here. In addition to the Dennis Miller article, you can find that at williamard.wordpress.com. I also use the Thrilling Detective website and the introduction to Calling Lou Largo, a essay called William Ard, A Tender Writer in a Tough World by Francis M. Nevins. So that's it for William Ard. I'll come back later in the episode and review All I Can Get for you, but you got a review you're going to do first, right?
Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about a Western, but it's not a Buchanan one. Today I'm discussing Clifton Adams and his 1962 novel, Day of the Gun. I really loved the author's 1969 novel, Trag's Choice, so I was anxious to read another of his Western novels. In this book, Sam Ingalls is an elderly, widowed man, and he's a former field marshal in and around the boom towns of the Oklahoma Territory. I could immediately sense that Ingalls had a few hills he chose to die on, but he miraculously survived all of those battles. Through brief backstories, it's conveyed that his wounds and age, combined with the approach of the 20th century, has led Ingalls to the twilight of his career. Now unemployed, Ingalls has arrived in the small town of Guthrie, Oklahoma, in hopes of obtaining a U.S. Marshal job. After departing the stagecoach, Ingalls has a brief, violent encounter with 3 young cattlemen after they push the old-timer into the dust. Afterwards, Ingalls meets the local marshal and learns that his application was denied due to age. Later that night, the dejected Ingalls is once again attacked by the 3 cattlemen. After 3 broken ribs and a vast array of bruises and cuts, Ingalls is left in the dirt to die. He awakens to find a woman named Kit tending to his wounds in a makeshift doctor's office. After talking with the young woman, he learns that Kit is actually an orphan that he saved years ago. Kit explains to Ingalls that a deranged killer named Elsie has victimized her for a number of years by murdering her husband and anyone else who attempts to befriend her. Fearing that Elsie will now target Ingalls, she urges him to heal up and leave town. But in an odd twist of fate, the man who won the U.S. Marshal job asks Ingalls if he can ride as a posse man. Tom, in the 1800s, the lowest tier of law enforcement is a posse man. So he's pretty much putting Ingalls way down the chain here. Ingalls must then decide to either swallow his pride and accept the lowly servitude, or simply leave town and pursue his next career choice as a cattleman. I loved that Adams created this awesome, experienced gun hand and introduced him to readers after the prime of his life. I thought that was genius. The idea that this action man is actually in the twilight of his career. Heck, it might even be like midnight considering Adams' health conditions. Or I should say, Ingalls' health conditions. It's a familiar formula, elderly striving to stay relevant in an age dominated by youth and change, but Adams is able to incorporate outside elements to distance himself from just an average retelling. The narrative focuses on a number of conflicts, primarily Ingalls contending with a younger, more resilient partner while tracking a killer. Ingalls' mysterious past is purposely left unexplored, which allowed readers to come to their own conclusions on his murky history. These are just small nuances that helped create a unique reading experience even for seasoned Western fans. I really enjoyed this book. Again, it's Day of the Gun by Clifton Adams.
He's so good. And he wrote just, I think, 3 or 4 crime novels, and a couple of them are reviewed on the Paperback Warrior site. I wish he had done more work in the crime fiction genre, but his Westerns are supposed to be awesome also. The guy was an American treasure. And again, a name that more people should know that they don't. It's just odd.
His Western, and I just bought it recently, The Last Days of Wolf Garrett, I think it's supposed to be his best.
Okay, good.
It's supposed to be a phenomenal Western.
All right, you'll probably get to it before I do, but I don't have enough good things to say about that guy. So now I want to circle back to William Ard and review a book called All I Can Get. But let me spoil the review right away. This book was so good. It makes me want to shave my head, put on a saffron robe, and sell pictures of William Ard at the airport. Wow. This guy was amazing. All I want to do is just drop out of society and read William Ard books, but I suspect that our readers and listeners would get tired of that. This is the first book in the Lou Largo series of private eye novels, which is the last series that William Ard wrote before he died. Largo's this charming and wisecracking Manhattan private eye with a difficult client, a wealthy media mogul named Milton Weston. Largo is hired to perform a background check on Mr. Weston's new infatuation, this gold-digging chippy that Mr. Weston intends to make his 8th wife. The tycoon is thoroughly uninterested in hearing the truth about this party girl and refuses to pay Largo's fee at a time when Largo's reserve funds are wearing thin. That's how the book opens. Ard begins this Lou Largo debut in a really fun, lighthearted style that reminded me of the Carter Brown mysteries, featuring kind of over-the-top, wealthy eccentrics who Largo is forced to endure, for business and economic reasons. Anyway, then things take this really clever turn. Nothing is as it seems in the opening act of this deceptively simple novel. Through a non-linear storyline with early novel flashbacks and flash-forwards, which reminded me a little bit of Quentin Tarantino's Reservoir Dogs and Pulp Fictions, the reader's treated to the story behind the story, and we learn that Largo has a little deception in his heart as well regarding this girl. And it's this sexy book, man. It never veers into pornography or graphic descriptions of lovemaking, but All I Can Get was surprisingly explicit for a 1959 novel. I just can't even imagine sex scenes like there were in this book in a 1952 novel. I mean, the world must have just changed a lot 7 years later. The sex scenes, they work in this book because they actually have real content, and they help to explain the decisions that the characters are making throughout this incredibly well-crafted paperback. As the story progresses, it becomes clear, though, that this doomed romance between this millionaire and this young sexpot is actually just a subplot, not the main dish. It switches gears, and then the real story involves this Cuban crime syndicate based out of Tampa's Ybor City neighborhood and a newspaper rivalry in a nearby beach town. Lou Largo's not even present for a large part of the book's second act, but sure enough, Ard weaves these threads into the early novel story of Largo, Mr. Weston, and his new fiancée. And all this ends up merging together for this conclusion of the book into this genuinely exciting and violent book. I don't want to give too much away here. It's a tough book to review. I don't want to spoil it. If you enjoy crime fiction and you can appreciate truly exceptional writing in the genre, you're bound to be pleased with All I Can Get. And it's as if Ard took a close look at the dumb but fun private eye subgenre, like the Carter Brown stuff, the Richard Prather, Shel Scott books, and said to himself, how can I turn this formula on its ear and make it really transcend the genre and become something really special? You'll appreciate this, Eric. Ard writes in the style popularized by Ed McBain in his 87th Precinct series. It's a third-person narration, but it has doses of personality and commentary sprinkled into the narration by this third-person omniscient point of view. It makes for a really fun read, and Ard's humorous narrative quips are really a delight. I found myself laughing out loud throughout this book. It gives the reader a sense that you're really in good hands. This was such a self-confident guy for a writer in his 30s, and just a twisty ride in this paperback. So, again, the book is called All I Can Get by William Ard. You can find it in the Ramble House compilation of the first 2 Lou Largo books titled Calling Lou Largo, available on Amazon. And I can't wait to read more by this guy. Anyway, I think we're running out of time, huh?
Hey, real fast before we go, Ramble House. You may have already said this, but are they in the U.S.?
I'm a little confused. I sent an email to them, just sort of picking their brain about their books, trying to get an understanding of what their catalog was like. I sent it to their basic address, and the guy who responded to me said, I've sort of given the company over to this fellow in Australia. And I emailed the guy in Australia, and he could not have been nicer. We were kind of going back and forth about what we do at Paperback Warrior and what he does at Ramble House and some of the titles that they have in the pipeline. And so my impression is that maybe the printing facility is in the U.S. I mean, it doesn't look like a Australian book. It's not coming from Australia, near as I can tell. I mean, I ordered this one on Amazon and paid for it, and it came. And so I don't have a good feel for what their corporate structure is. I just don't.
Do they sell ebooks?
You and I were looking at their catalog. Most of their books are not available as ebooks, but there's a couple that are. And
okay.
So I don't understand the business model, but all I know is that they're putting out some amazing stuff. How they ended up kind of beating everybody to the punch to get the William Ard library is amazing, because that guy's used paperbacks go from like $50 to $100 per paperback.
Right. Yeah, that's great.
Anyway, that's our show for this week. We'd love for you to join us at paperbackwarrior.com every day for book reviews and articles, as well as the podcast next Monday. So thank you so much for joining us. Be cool and stay safe.
Bye-bye now.